hello to Kevin Tripp, news reporter at KABC in Los Angeles, because a lot of people getting the knickers into twist about Donald Trump and his tariff war, his trade war. He's put tariffs on China, he's put tariffs on Mexico, he's put tariffs on Canada. Let's have a listen to what he's got to say about possible tariffs for this part of the world.
Well, we're going to see what happens. It'll happen, but we'll see how things work out. It might happen with them, but it will definitely happen with the European Union. I can tell you that. Prime Minister Starmer has been very nice. We've had a couple of meetings. We've had numerous phone calls. We're getting along very well, and we'll see whether or not we can balance out our budget. With the European Union, it's $350 billion deficit. So obviously something's going to take place there.
Yeah, so very interesting what's going to happen in the coming days and weeks when it comes to the US economy and, different countries responding to whatever it is that he's doing. Let's talk to Kevin Tripp and find out, how it's going down so far. Kevin, very good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Mike.
I was reading this morning that a lot of Canadian bars are taking out all of their American drinks and putting them away and replacing them with Canadian drinks and all that sort of thing. But how's it all going over there in terms of not so much what Americans are thinking, but what are the Canadians saying, what are the Mexicans saying?
The Canadians in particular are shocked, they're saddened, and they're quite furious about the whole situation. It's worth noting that there hasn't really been a lot of friction between Canada and the United States, not even on economic issues. I mean, little things here and there. But Donald Trump has not really spelled out his demands for how Canada could avoid these tariffs. He's talked about cracking down on fentanyl and the trade deficit, but he's never given any specific metrics specifically to Canada on what they could do, what they could change to avoid these 25% tariffs, which could be incredibly detrimental just to the average person who's trying to buy groceries.
Yeah, right. And what is it? I mean, I'm forgive me for being ignorant. I mean, I lived in the States for 10 years, and I used to go to Canada quite a lot, mostly the East Coast, to Toronto and Ottawa and places like that. But, I mean, what is it that is mostly exported from Canada to the US?
Major exports are lumber, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you're talking about housing, it is a big deal because tens of thousands of houses being built, we could see dramatically higher housing prices. We have a lot of food that goes back and forth. Some critics are calling this the beer tax because you've got big producers like Molson, one of the biggest beer companies in the world. In Canada, the Super Bowl is coming up. A lot of beer is going to be suddenly more expensive for the average American who can't afford more expensive things. And this is having ripple effects across the world. We just saw the Asian and Australian stock markets drop 2 to 3%, with England and European markets set to open and later American markets. There's people on pins and needles, whether this is going to really tank the stock markets today and in future days to come, and what ripple effects that could have across the Atlantic and across the Pacific. I should mention, the largest liquor company in the world is just down the street from you. It's Diageo. They own dozens and dozens of brands. With Canada banning some of those brands, not just from the restaurants, but from their state liquor stores, Ontario, Nova Scotia, British Columbia, those state-controlled liquor stores are now taking American brown liquor off the shelf, some of those owned by Diageo. This could have global implications.
Right. And I guess Donald Trump's people would say, well, the reason we're doing it, though, is to make American products then more competitive, I suppose, and so that people will buy. I don't know if Canadian beer from Molson is any cheaper than Budweiser. Probably isn't. But if it's now more expensive, maybe people will in their hopeful thinking anyway, buy American beer instead of Canadian beer.
I think that's the hope of the Trump administration. And in previous generations, that was easier to do. With a more tied together global economy, it's harder to separate those items that are domestic and imported. There's also a real fear among economists that American producers will also raise their prices, essentially because they can get away with it. If you're on the store shelves, you might say, okay, well, if I'm an American brand that's not facing a tariff, I can undercut my competitor. Or maybe I'll just raise my price as well, because if we're all at the same price point, we can all charge the same amount. So we'll see what happens. But this could even affect things like automobiles. Most Japanese cars are not directly impacted by tariffs. However, Honda, Nissan, other companies they make their cars in Mexico and then move them across the border into America. So those would be impacted by the Mexican tariffs. So a $50,000 car, which is about 38,000 pounds, would suddenly be hit with a $12,500 tariff, making it incredibly unaffordable, literally overnight, for some of those consumers.
Yeah, and again, you know, he's been quite open about this. He said to the Chinese, you want to make cars that you sell into America, then make them in America. And if you have a factory in America, then we won't charge you these tariffs, which, and again, in their minds, is the sensible way to protect American jobs.
And there are some Japanese car companies that make cars in the United States. However, it's worth noting for my British friends, 30 years ago, we passed the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which unites Canada, Mexico, and the United States into a trading system where there aren't many tariffs. And they deliberately set up the system so that you could have car manufacturing cross borders. I mean, even in Canada, some American cars are made north of the border as well as south of the border. Sometimes the engine is made in one country and the frame is made in another country, and they're all assembled sometimes in the United States. So with so much of the economy interwoven between our three countries, it is inevitable that consumers are going to be paying higher prices for all kinds of goods if these tariffs go into effect. I should mention, they're scheduled to go into effect in exactly 24 hours. So we'll see if that comes to fruition.
And it may well be that, you know, like a lot of the things that Donald Trump does, this is a bit of a sword waving exercise, and that he wants to see people making some kind of move towards either clamping down on some of the illegal migration that's going on, or possibly, you know, the drug trafficking and the drug, business that goes across all the borders as well. And I guess, again, he would say, you know, the NAFTA agreement was signed when we had a very different world. You know, we didn't have some of the problems that we now have.
Certainly. I mean, the borders used to be less porous in previous generations. You know, we didn't have as much commerce across the border. Canada, though, is still puzzling. It is not a giant hub of drug activity. Yes, there are drugs that are smuggled across the border. I should say in both directions. There are drugs that are smuggled from the U.S. into Canada and some that are smuggled from Canada into the U.S., but nothing like the Mexican border. So the idea that a trade war with Canada is going to crack down on drug trafficking is a bit mysterious, even to those experts who track drug trafficking specifically.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting week, again, I dare say. And we're only in, week 2 and a bit, I think. There was sort of the other thing that's quite surprising. You know, the world's getting shaken up every single day. Kevin, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Kevin Tripp, news reporter, KABC Radio in Los